change discussions. I'm talking, of course, about what has been happening in Glasgow this afternoon, and we start there, where in Glasgow, the United Nations COP26 Climate Change Summit is underway. You'll have seen the important announcements coming through last week about our country and those agreements to help us move away from using coal to produce electricity. But we're still due to use coal to produce electricity at the Medupi and Kusile power stations for the next 50 years. You could argue that no one's really producing very much electricity in South Africa at the moment on stage 4 load shedding. Professor Vishwas Satgar is a Wits academic. He's also a climate justice charter movement activist. Professor Satgar, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. So many people are claiming that COP26, that this is a big moment. The transition to renewable energy is now going to happen, and it's going to happen now. Do you believe that?
No. and basically, if you look at the arguments that are really being made 1 week into this COP, particularly by leading street voices, networks, people's platform spaces, etc., Greta Thunberg, many others, there's a deep despondency. And that's got to do with various things. I mean, the first is that the nationally determined commitments that governments have placed formally into this COP process are going to take us to a 2.7 degrees Celsius increase in planetary temperature. Now, these commitments are also not legally binding, Stephen. You must appreciate that. So a lot of the puff and the rhetoric and hard talk and spin that's coming through really is going to get exposed at the level of implementation policies, just transition policies and frameworks. And this is where, you know, there's a lack of detail. There's clearly not serious policy commitments and so on. So that's the first thing. The second is one of the big initiatives that the UK government placed on the agenda, because it was the convening country, was the phase out of coal. Now, this was the first time in the history of COP negotiations that the issue of a phase out of a fossil fuel was placed centrally on the agenda. Now, what has happened, interestingly enough, is that the big coal users and polluters, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's the United States, they have not signed on to that agreement. South Africa has not signed on to the phase out of coal agreement, which is meant to really move things along by 2030. So you're seeing this lack of serious commitment, and yet there's a dire need for us to be phasing out fossil fuels urgently and quickly. The other point to make related to this is the idea of a phase-out fossil fuel treaty. And we hosted an assembly the other day, an alternative COP, and the Climate Justice Charter calls for the rapid phase-out of fossil fuels, including a treaty, and we introduced a network partner that was at the COP. And there was a very important point made, that again, the methodology of the COP is not such that you can have very, very clear commitments, let's just say from fossil fuels, let's just say from airlines, from the food industry, etc., around decarbonization. That's not how it's working in the COP process. So it's really hard to measure. It's really hard to work out what the depth of commitment is. It's really hard to quantify these things. So that's another indicator, if you like, of our deep concerns around this COP. And this has been a trajectory, by the way, for almost 3 decades. I think the third important point that we have to keep on board here is that finance. Now, the International Energy Agency, before this COP summit said we need to really ramp up investment in renewable energies. It recognized that there was a massive investment gap. And actually, you're seeing that. You're seeing the failure of policy in the context of European energy prices going up, in the context of US energy prices going up, further confirming the point that the International Energy Agency is making, that for this transition to work, we need massive, almost triple investments into renewable energies. And this is not happening. So ultimately, these are some of the concerns that are informing the pessimism, and actually leading people to conclude that this is a COP summit that's really a cop-out, and that is going to bring further injustice to our world.
So, Professor Satgar, I hear everything that you say. Isn't this, in the end, about economics? If renewable energy is reliable and cheap, people will use it. And the only thing that would stop them would be entrenched interests. And I mean, I know there'll be plenty of entrenched interests in the fossil fuel industry.
Yes, I mean, these are lock-ins. I mean, so what you're talking about is infrastructures that have been built up over decades. You are talking about oil companies that have, if you like, done a whole lot of investment in this industry, and they are keeping those spigots open, whether they're gas, oil, or coal. And our economies are on those pathways, if you like. Now, these interests have been influential throughout the COP negotiations because, as I've been saying, they have not let the phase out of fossil fuels feature prominently in the methodological thinking, in the policy making process of the COP, and in nation states, and so on. So you have this lock-in, which is really very dangerous. The only way that these interests can be challenged head on is if countries muster the will to put forward the deep, just transition now and ensure that there's a planned exit, which means that if you look at South Africa, every sector of the South African economy has to come to this challenge. So, Sasol is the largest energy fossil fuel user and actually, emitter of point emissions in the world. Sasol doesn't have an ambitious plan, and the South African government hasn't pushed Sasol hard enough to have a plan to cut emissions dramatically. Eskom the same. I mean, we can talk about the Eskom deal. But then, of course, you also have to look at transport, you have to look at cement, etc., agriculture. And so all of these things have to really be taken very seriously at the level of national climate policies for the deep, just transition. So this is where the failing is. And so, you've had over 3 decades of science, you've had over 3 decades of dialogue and engagement, and yet political leadership has not risen to the challenge. And those who are going to pay the price are ordinary human beings, you and me, and the other species that we share this planet with.
I mean, it's so interesting. I forget the name of the American president now, but it was in 1979, I think, that they put, for the first time, solar-powered water heaters on a roof at the White House. And, I mean, they were then taken down when Ronald Reagan came in. I mean, that's going back to the 1970s. Professor Satgar, isn't there also a slight timing problem? And let me just explain what I mean. In Europe now, it looks like there'll be an energy shortage. They're going into their winter, and unlike us, they actually require energy to stay warm, particularly elder people. They have older populations than we do. And what that means is, because there's been, this is how it was explained to me, a shortage of wind over their summer months, because of problems in the gas industry, gas prices have gone sky high. There's now a shortage of ways to keep people warm in Europe. So in other words, could COP26 have come at just the worst time? There's now the idea that, yes, we were going to transition. Now we've seen a shock in Europe, and as a result of that, we're going to have to go back to coal.
So what we're dealing with here geopolitically is the game that OPEC and Russia are playing at the moment. And that's been revealed. I mean, they've cut back supply. Russia is a major gas supplier to Europe, and that's also pushed up prices. And I think that was timed. I think it was really timed to unsettle energy markets and at the same time, if you like, torpedo the kind of serious discourse that we need. Both Russia, China were not present. The heads of state were not present at this COP, which sends another very interesting message and signal to the world. And I think that's got to be put into perspective in thinking about what's going on here. But I also think that this is a short-termist dynamic. And again, it comes back to how fast and how accelerated the transitions need and have to be. As long as we're going to be, if you like, trying to balance these interests rather than roll out a whole new sort of leap beyond existing institutions, interest structures, etc., we're really not going to solve this problem. It's time for decisive policy and decision making to happen. Now, just to pick up, I mean, yes, Jimmy Carter was the president that had solar panels on the White House roof. And actually, he was warned by the leading climate scientists in the late 70s that climate change is a real problem. He commissioned a study through the U.S. Academy of Sciences to really think more deeply about this problem. That report was tabled by 1983, and Reagan really pushed it aside. But beyond that, a very, very powerful lobby developed in the United States off the fossil fuel industries and so on. And they were able then to win, if you like, by creating doubt about climate science, engendering a whole machinery of think tanks, etc., and putting money into the sort of Washington Beltway, such that you had inaction up to now vis-a-vis the American political elite. And that's the challenge that we are facing. The flip side of this, of course, is that renewable energies and technologies, in terms of economies of scale, I mean, China, ironically, is one of the largest manufacturers of renewable energy technologies in the world. And yet it is still, at the same time, one of the biggest users of coal. It has massive coal endowments, and it's still going to be building more coal-fired power stations. But yet we have these prices coming down. The unit costs of electricity, which will benefit consumers coming from renewables, has proven itself. In South Africa, there's been, we've had these windows opening up renewable energies into our grid, etc. We can see that the unit costs have a benefit for consumers. Stellenbosch University has done a very, very interesting study on offshore wind. And what it is showing is that we can meet our energy needs 8 times more than coal with offshore wind. Of course, this is going to require smart grids. It's going to require battery systems. And it's going to really require a whole new regulatory architecture. Many countries are already putting these elements in place. You're seeing some of this in Spain. You're seeing some of this in Germany. You're seeing some of this even in the UK. And so, if you like, the future's in the making. It's there before us. It's a question of us really making the leap. And that is something that has to happen now.
I mean, you would like to think that things are going to change, that, one of the things that we're trying to do now is move to renewable energy. Now, we're on stage 4 load shedding, Professor. We're lucky to be able to get a Zoom call through to you, frankly. What that means is we want to make a change to the biggest change we will make in the history of our electricity generation system, a massive change, and we can't keep the system we have now working. So some people would say, if we can't keep the system we have working, why make a change? And the obvious answer is because the change is morally the right thing to do.
Yes, and the systemic failure is also making the argument for the change. And I think we've got to really inspect the Eskom crisis very, very closely. We have to put it under the magnifying glass. And we've got to historicize it. Yes, so yes, the ANC government inherited Eskom. Eskom at that time was one of the top sort of energy utilities in the world. It did a lot of strategic planning of our energy system, etc. A lot of that capacity was denuded and undermined under the ANC government. At the same time, as you know, and as it's being revealed, sort of looting practices developed within Eskom. At the same time, instead of the ANC planning very carefully a transition, because it's been part of the multilateral negotiations for almost 3 decades and so on, the science is very clear. Instead, they chose to invest in some of the largest coal-fired power stations in the world. Now, this again is a lock-in, okay? But again, going big didn't mean you were solving the problem, because going big meant cost overruns. It meant a whole host of technical failures and problems. And of course, there was corruption. ANC Chancellor House, the current head of the Presidential Commission on Climate, Bali Musa, was also implicated in some of this, etc. So this is what we've ended up with. We have a mess, basically. And so Eskom is at the heart of our energy crisis. It's at the heart of our economic crisis. And it actually makes the case for us to really think beyond it now. The time has come. And I think there's some very, very interesting arguments being made about how this transition can happen. The first argument is that it's clear that with the way renewable energy prices are moving, you're really not going to get massive investment, if you like, from the private sector to boost renewable energy rollout. And hence, you're going to have some level of public involvement in this. And I think this is a very, very important argument that has to be considered in terms of fiscal spend, in terms of capital spend around this transition. I think the second argument that's being made very, very strongly is around the role of local government.
Satgar, Professor, I must apologize. I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you. Professor Vishwas Satgar is a Wits academic, also, as you can hear, a climate change activist at the Climate Justice Charter Movement.